All right, today we're going to decode a single line from the Quran. Just one line, but it's one that has sparked centuries of debate and honestly carries some huge ethical weight. We're going to break down a really powerful argument that says the way it's usually understood, well, it might just be based on a massive misreading. So, this is the phrase right here from the fourth verse of the 65th chapter or Surah of the Quran. You know, if you just look at it on its own, it doesn't seem like much. But in its traditional context, wow. Those few words have been used to justify a practice with, well, staggering implications, is putting it mildly. And that's why this verse is so incredibly important. See, the conventional reading, the one you'll hear most often, takes this to mean it's setting out legal waiting periods after a divorce. And that includes for girls who are so young they haven't even started their period yet. The implication there is, yeah, it's huge. And it's exactly why we need to take a much closer look at this verse. So that brings us to the big question, right? What if the key to understanding this is already inside the text itself? What if we set aside the external traditions for a moment and just use the Quran as its own dictionary? Well, this analysis argues that when you do that, a completely different picture starts to emerge, one that's actually ethically consistent. Let's see how this works. Okay, so the methodology here is absolutely crucial. Think of it like a stress test. We're going to take the common interpretation and really put it through its paces. But here's the rule. We can only use the Quran's own logic and its own definitions. So the whole idea is to check if this traditional reading, the one that says this is all about biology and young girls, actually holds up. Does it even fit with the themes of the very chapter it's in? Does it clash with other core principles in the book? And does it make any logical sense in the flow of the text? Let's find out. All right, time to run that stress test. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because when you put this conventional interpretation under the microscope, it doesn't just show a few minor cracks. It pretty much begins to collapse. Okay, so the first big problem hits you right away. On the one hand, the traditional reading of our verse seems to allow for marriage with minors. But then you look at another verse, 4:6, and it explicitly demands that you test orphans for sound judgment before you can even trust them with their own property. The contradiction is just right there. I mean, if a child doesn't have the judgment for a financial contract, how on earth could they have the judgment for a marriage contract? And it's not just that one verse. Not by a long shot. This analysis points out that the traditional reading clashes with the entire Qur'anic idea of what marriage is. I mean, think about it. A minor can't truly give consent, which goes against the rule forbidding coercion. Then there's the whole purpose of marriage, tranquility, mutual partnership. That's impossible with a child. And finally, how can a minor enter into what the Quran itself calls a solemn covenant? You see, the problems just keep piling up. And if we zoom out from the specific verses, there's a huge thematic problem too. The chapter this verse is in, Surah 65, is all about justice, fairness, and being ethically responsible. It hammers these points home again and again. So if you suddenly drop a very specific rule about female biology right in the middle of it, it just feels completely out of place. A chapter about universal morality suddenly becomes this narrow biological rulebook. The whole thing just doesn't hang together. So, okay. If the traditional reading creates all these contradictions, what's going on? Where did things go wrong? Well, the argument we're looking at says the problem isn't the text, not at all. The problem comes down to the translation of one single crucial word. And this is the word al-mahyid. For literally centuries, this word has been translated and understood one way and one way only, as the biological process of menstruation. This definition is the absolute bedrock of that traditional interpretation we've been talking about. But, and this is the absolute core of the new argument, the Quran actually defines this term itself in another verse, 2:22:2. In that verse, when the text is asked about al-mahid, it doesn't say it is a biological process or it is bleeding. It says it is adha. And adha is an Arabic word that means a state of harm or disturbance or dysfunction. So you see, that's not a biological definition at all. It's an ethical one. And what's really cool is that this new definition gets even more support when you look at the word's linguistic root. The Arabic root letters, haid, yat, dad, they carry this core meaning of overflowing or deviating or becoming turbulent. That fits perfectly with this idea of a state of disturbance, right? It points to some kind of relational or ethical turbulence, not a simple biological function.
So what happens when we do that? What happens when we swap out the old biological definition for this new ethical one? Well, something pretty amazing happens. A totally new and completely consistent picture of the verse and the whole chapter starts to take shape.
The whole meaning of the verse just flips. Suddenly, it's not about women's reproductive cycles at all. Instead, this analysis argues it's describing three different kinds of dependence during a separation. You've got those who are in a state of relational disturbance, those who aren't, and then those whose situation is still kind of up in the air. It becomes a guide for ethical judgment, not a biology textbook. And with this new ethical reading in place, the entire chapter, Surah 65, just clicks. It all makes sense now. It flows in this really clear, logical way. It starts small, with rules for how to handle dependence ethically. Then it zooms out to economic justice. Then it zooms out even further to give historical examples of what happens when communities are unjust. And it ends with the biggest picture of all, the justice baked into the entire cosmic order. And that brings us to what you could call the final piece of evidence, the smoking gun, if you will. It's the ending of the chapter itself, which really seems to lock in the idea that the theme here is universal justice, not specific biology.
I mean, this is the question that just blows the traditional reading out of the water. The very last verse of the chapter talks about the creation of the heavens and the earth. Think about that. If this whole chapter was really about divorce rules and menstrual cycles, why on earth would it end with a grand statement about the creation of the cosmos? It doesn't connect. It makes no sense at all. But with this new interpretation, the ending is perfect. It's the perfect finale. If the chapter is all about justice and measure and ethical order, then ending with a statement on the perfect measure and order of the universe is a beautiful, fitting conclusion. It ties the tiny world of our personal ethics directly to the massive scale of cosmic order.
So let's recap. By changing the definition of just one word, a change based on the Quran's own internal dictionary, this analysis claims to solve every single contradiction we brought up. The clash with marriage principles? Gone. The weird, inconsistent theme? Fixed. The broken logical flow? Restored. And that bizarre ending? It now makes perfect sense. So when you get right down to it, the argument is pretty simple. The text was never the problem. The way we were reading it was. By applying this strict internal consistency test, a verse that, let's be honest, has been used to justify some really difficult practices, gets completely transformed. It becomes a profound statement on relational justice, and it fits perfectly inside a chapter all about universal moral order. And that really leaves us with a final big picture thought. We focused on just one verse in one book today. But the method itself, this idea of letting a text define its own terms, separate from later traditions, that's a really powerful tool. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other foundational texts, what other big ideas might look completely different if we applied the same kind of rigorous test to them?